So hopefully at this point you've looked through a topic, or maybe you started a couple and finally found one where you were able to get through all 5 analysis prompts and still have something that you feel like you could work with, okay? It's completely fine if you don't feel like it's really strong. It's also fine if this isn't necessarily where you think you'll end up going. For now, what we're going to do is we're going to take that topic or EE idea that you've used for the basis of your analysis prompts, and we're going to talk about triangles. Or more specifically, we're going to talk about a narrowing process, how you can take what is a big idea to start with and narrow it down effectively into a manageable question for a 4,000 word research paper. So let's talk about how this will work. So what we want to do here is we want to break down your idea, and we want to make it so that it passes the scope or scale component of the research question. One of the marking criteria looks specifically at how effectively you've chosen the focus of your essay. If you go too broad, you'll end up with an essay that's quite shallow. You'll have lots to talk about, but you'll only be able to touch on things briefly before you're out of words, okay? So the goal here is to actually get our essay focused down to something in which you can take a deeper look so that you've got the room to genuinely critically evaluate the arguments you're making, so you end up with a good research question. So let's take a look at our triangle now. I'm just going to shrink me out of the way. All right, so you all have a worksheet with this triangle on it, okay? And I'm going to talk you through how this will work. At the base of your worksheet, the first thing you should do is write down at the very bottom what is the idea that we're working with. So hopefully your idea is still fairly broad, so it might be something like macroeconomics in Europe, or it could be a little bit narrower. You might want to talk about currency in Europe or inflation. You might want to talk about engines, okay, or car engines, okay? But the key here is to have your topic. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to conduct 2 steps or 2 rounds of limiting factors. So limiting factors are things that help us to narrow your topics and contexts into smaller subsections. So we're going to work through an example. I apologize, it's an economics example because that's what I'm familiar with. But it should work for any topic you choose, okay? So let's say that I've started with macroeconomics in Europe, okay? I've gone intentionally broad. It's okay if you're a little bit narrower than that. So on my left-hand side of my triangle where my topics go, the first thing I'm going to put in the left-hand topics limiting factors box is all of the subtopics that I can think about in relation to the macroeconomics component. So I might put inflation, I might put unemployment, I might put economic growth, I might look at trade, I might flash currency, I might look at income gap. There's a whole bunch of factors I could include here. And I'm going to put all of these subtopics into that box. In the right-hand box where it says context, that's where I'm going to look at the focus of my essay in terms of the subject matter. So if topics is all of my kind of theory or my economics areas, context is my Europe bit. So macroeconomics in Europe. So can I break Europe down? Well, I can. So I could say Europe, but I could also say a range of countries. So I might be interested in Germany, Austria, and France. I could even consider breaking that one step further into, say, a block or cities, okay? And I'm going to put the limiting context and the limiting topics. After round 1, I'm going to look at those topics and contexts, and based on what I know from my previous analysis of the topic, I'm going to go, okay, well, where might there be something to really look at? So I might decide, let's say I want to go with something like the challenges of economic growth in Germany. So in my second box, I'm going to take economic growth and I'm going to take Germany. And I'm going to go, could I break this down further? Well, the factors affecting economic growth in Germany might relate to a particular industry, or it might relate to a particular area of economic growth, like government spending. And so I'm going to put all of those sub-elements into my limiting factors box at level 2. On my context side, I might decide to look at Germany as a whole still, or I might say, actually, even though I'm looking at a macroeconomics indicator, I'm particularly interested about the effect of that economic outcome on a city in Germany, like Berlin, okay, or a rural community, for example. So I'm going to pick a couple of those. Now, I've limited this second round, and it's now time to say, okay, well, which one from each is going to be most effective? So I'm actually interested in government spending on agriculture. That's the part of economic growth I'm interested in. And I'm interested in its impact on a small village north of Berlin. Okay? So they're the two things I'm going to put in my viability box. In my viability box at the bottom, I'm going to write government spending on agriculture and the name of the city. Okay? Now at the viability level, I have to ask myself some important questions. I need to consider the research viability. In other words, can I actually answer a question about this topic and this context? So some things to think about with viability, and you can scribble notes in your viability boxes. Things to think about might include, how much time do you have? Now, I've told you that this process is going to have a draft coming in at the end of the summer. But be really conscious of not assuming that you will spend your entire summer collecting data and agonizing over, various ranges of arguments and poring over 300 different secondary sources, okay? You need to be realistic about how much time you have available to spend on your extended essay, because as I'm sure you're all starting to appreciate, the IB is a busy time in your lives and you have lots of commitments. You have IA work, you have in-class tests, you have CAS commitments that you have to reach, you'll have TOK things, not to mention your own personal commitments outside of school, okay? So really start by thinking, how much time would it take to research this? So for example, am I going to need to sit and do 300 hours of observation to answer this question? Probably not viable. And then review it. You're also going to need to think about access to data. So is there secondary research available if you're relying on that? So for example, is there a government report that you can use? You might also be asking yourself, do you need to conduct primary research like an interview? Or if you're going to do that, who would you talk to? Are you going to be able to get access to those kinds of people? If you're doing science, remember experiment limitations. So think about, can you answer this question with the research that's out there already? Or would you definitely need an experiment, in which case maybe it's not an option? So how will you do that? And lastly, type of research. And by type of research, I'm still talking about the primary, secondary, observations, surveys, experiments. But I'm talking about it more in terms of how you feel about approaching it. So some people absolutely love conducting interviews, standing on street corners, having surveys. They like engaging with people in that manner. Other people, it's their worst nightmare. Having to contact people and randomly ask them to give you information makes them feel really anxious and uncomfortable. That's okay. The key here is to think about, okay, well, if this particular question is going to require me to do those kinds of research, am I going to put off doing my research because I'm not comfortable with the type? Okay, and if the answer is yes, perhaps this isn't the question for you. Now, let's assume you looked at all the viability factors and your topic and context work. Now it's time to turn it into your final question statement. So in the top triangle of our triangle, you are going to reformat your topic and context into a question. Your extended essay must have a question, i.e. a statement with a question mark at the end of it. This is critical. Old essays, you'll notice, might have titles, so it's a statement rather than a question. Yours must be a question. So take some time, think about how your topic engages with your context, and then format a question. You'll find on the Google site that we're using to guide you through today's activities that there is a link to some question starters that will help you to do this quickly. Now remember, this final question does not have to be the perfect final question, but it should be a considered final question. So when you submit your proposal, the goal is not to have perfect questions, But you should be able to logically explain to your supervisor when you get allocated how you got to the question, why you think it's viable, how you think you will approach it. Okay, and if it turns out the question needs changing, and they often do, that's fine. But at least you've shown that you've thought through the process rather than kind of throwing a question out there and discovering a month or two into the process that actually this question is not practical. So I'm going to leave you with your triangles. You'll have the rest of this session to do that, except for one last activity at the end. So off you go.